Spring Creek Model Trains is hitting the road and taking scale signs along for the ride. The signs that bring your models to life can now be found in Deschler, Nebraska, and at train shows throughout the country. On February 7th and 8th, Spring Creek Model Trains is going to be at the Wichita Train Show and Swap Meet at the Cessna Activity Center in Wichita, Kansas, and at the Great Train Show at the Indiana State Fairgrounds and Event Center in Indianapolis, Indiana. And to see more of the largest collection of handcrafted scale signs on the planet, head to scalesigns.com. Hey, do you like free stuff? As a member of the operating crew, you'll get a chance to win awesome prizes each month. For less than a dime a day, you'll be entered to win, and just as important, your support helps keep every episode from behind a paywall and free of those unrelated and annoying commercials you hear on other podcasts. Sign up today at aroundthelayout.com/crew, and thank you for your support. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com.
ATLP Rewind.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me tonight, Erik Pioselli. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ray. It's great to be here. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. It is 2025. You get to be the first new show of 2025. No pressure.
No pressure.
As we roll into a new year. Looking forward to 2025 and talking to some new folks, including yourself. But you're not new to me. I've known you for quite a while now, and we've connected several times in person. I think we met first time in person at Amherst.
We did. We met, I would say that would be 2022. It was the year of the snowstorm.
Yeah, there it is. So yeah, it snowed in 2022. Yep. So we met there in person, and then met you trackside at Mindock Park, and you and I share an interest in rail fanning, and you get there a little bit more than I do. I think you're living a little bit closer to the river line than I am, but
without a doubt. Without a doubt.
So, and that's what I see in your Facebook page. I see a lot of awesome rail fanning photos and opportunities for you to get out there, including one in the snow recently.
Thanks, Trey. Yeah, I'm about 45 minutes away from Mindock Park, and if those of you at home that don't know where that is, it's on the CSX River Sub. It's about it's actually 45 minutes due north of Weehawken, New Jersey, and I get out there a lot, and it's a neat place to go rail fanning any time of the year except the fall, because in the fall, you get quite a bit of traffic coming up from New York City of non-rail fans, and they tend to swarm the place. And photography after, let's say, 10 o'clock till 4 o'clock is pretty much out of the question. It gets a little congested, but it is a great place to rail fan, especially that area, because from about milepost, let's say, 41, it really gets interesting down at Iona Island, and from there all the way up past, let's say, Highland, New York. There's a lot of photo opportunities, but I've gone all the way up to Selkirk numerous times in the last decade or so. Really come back to rail fanning after the kids got a little bit older, after I got married, because as we know, marriage and kids, things like that get put on the back burner quite quickly. And, I've taken advantage of my son being older, and he shares similar interest as I do in the model railroading and the prototype aspect of it. So whenever we can, in fact, this week, we're trying to get back down there before he goes back to school one last time. And I was down there a couple weeks ago. It was one of those days where it had snowed in the morning, and making my way to work was becoming more and more of a hassle. And I said, enough is enough with this traffic and the snow. I said, I'm going to pull over for a couple hours. And that's what I did. And I sat down there and got my senses back. It got my blood pressure down and just kind of chilled out and, had a good time. Just, there wasn't that much action that day, but it was just calm and very serene. And the two trains I did get on the CSX sub are intermodal trains, one northbound, one southbound. And just having those two trains, made it all the worthwhile.
One thing that's kind of neat about the River Sub, and I hope I describe it correctly, it's a lot of single track with holding sidings. right? So you get quite a bit of that traffic, and you can be in a spot where it's quiet for a while, but then all of a sudden it could light up, and you could see two or three trains just as they come out of holding sidings, and they're passing each other, et cetera. So there could be some pretty good action at times on that line.
With a lot of railfan places, it can be hit or miss. It can be quiet or it can be nonstop action, and it tends to be busiest mostly in early hours in the morning till about mid to late morning. And like you said, that siding between milepost 43 and 45, that's a pretty good place to catch quite a bit of the meets. There's another siding up between Cornwall and Newburgh. There's one further up towards Highland, and there's a few south of us. You just have to listen to the radio, and the more you get down there and you learn the pattern, you kind of learn the symbols of the CSX trains. You can kind of gauge what you're going to see on a given weekday. It's pretty much you're going to walk away 5, 6, 7, 8 trains for an average morning. I don't usually spend all day down there. Usually, like I said, in the morning because the light is much better. You do have Amtrak and Metro North on the other side of the river. So if it gets slow on the west side, you can just jump across, any of the major bridges like the Bear Mountain Bridge or the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, and head over and see what's going on in Metro North. They do have a few of the heritage units, which always I see them on that side from the other side of the river. So if I go over there,
They all
the
disappear,
CSX,
huh?
everything will come down the CSX. So it's like kind of like cat and mouse, more or less.
Yeah.
So win some, lose some. But it's a neat place to rail fan. It's not the only place I rail fan. I try to get out, locally as much as possible. There's the Middletown, New Jersey, which operates out of Campbell Hall. Every day of the week, there's train going someplace, and sometimes they'll operate 2 different jobs. And that's an interesting railroad because it's kind of like one of the last short lines in Orange County, New York, that made it through all the transition from Conrail and Penn Central and Norfolk Southern. And believe it or not, next to CSX on the West Shore line, they're the last, they're the last freight railroad that's still like the last man standing almost. And even though their line's been cut back, over the years, they've actually grown by taking over some of the ex Conrail and Norfolk Southern lines in the past 2 decades. So it tends to be interesting. I also do a lot. I go out on the Reading line out from Allentown and towards Reading, and some of the DL, Delaware Lackawanna out of Scranton, try to hit that for Alco action. But it's kind of not the same that it used to be 40 or 50 years ago when, I started, when I came into the world, let's say. And there's been a lot of changes in the Northeast. We're living in a different time now, and it's unfortunate to see what we missed, but I try to preserve it photographically as much as I can now for generations going forward. That's the way I have an outlook on things.
Yeah, it's kind of the comment I keep making using the term golden age, right? Eventually it'll become somebody's golden age, maybe your son's or whatnot, when he says, I remember when they used to run on the river sub or those
Right,
kinds of things. Who knows what the future holds, right? But
right,
yeah, it's definitely, it's even different from 10, 15, 20 years ago. You to mention 40, 50 years ago, but the traffic, and even I used to go up to Selkirk, get west of Selkirk out to Voorheesville, and it used to be, Monday morning freeway going out of Selkirk Yard heading west. It was just train after train after train. And now it's decent, but it's not what it used to be.
not what
It's
it used to
not.
be.
Yeah. It's just not the
Yep,
heavy traffic that we once
yep.
saw. Then you mentioned the MNJ, and I didn't even know they existed until, I don't know, I would say about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was calling on a customer somewhere in New York and happened to come upon them, and they were coupled to an NS 4-axle locomotive as well. So they had MNJ power on one end and NS on the other, and they were servicing a lumber yard. And it's just amazing all these other small railroads that are out there that are just, you don't know about them, or they're kind of
Right,
quiet. And yeah, but
right.
they're always fun to find.
Sure, sure. Mid 2000s, they acquired what they called the Campbell Hall cluster, and that was the Conrail former Erie Lackawanna line up to Montgomery, up to Walden, the ex Lehigh and Hudson from Campbell Hall down to Warwick that Conrail operated, and then eventually Norfolk Southern took over as just a local operation. The Middletown, New Jersey itself, which is just a short branch now from what's basically called 4-story junction on Metro North, commuter line west of Middletown, and they just go into Middletown. And that line was cut back. They used to operate out to Slate Hill to a company called Balchem, and that got cut back just to Dolson Avenue now. There's a team track down there. In fact, there was another customer that they just closed called Genpack. They received covered hoppers of plastic pellets because of the styrofoam, pressures on the environment and everything else. They just decided they gave it up. I think they're going to move the plant down to somewhere down south, and there's just not the demand, I guess, for the styrofoam cups that they used to make. Not sure exactly that, but they've picked up a couple other customers, especially up in the former New Haven Maybrook yard. They picked up a propane customer up there called Crestwood, and that's the bulk of their traffic. I want to say right now, there's pretty much 7 or 8 cars every other day going up to Crestwood, especially this time of year. So it's not an easy, and there's not that many places to photograph it because it's a short distance and it's really limited access. But the branch up to Walden is a great one. You can chase them. They only go about 10 or 15 miles an hour. The branch down in Warwick's another good one, and that's the line I grew up basically for my entire childhood, let's say. So it's a interesting line, like you said. You don't know what you're going to see, and they had some former NS Power, which they actually painted up with black and white, which is kind of reminiscent of their 44 tonner paint scheme from 50 years ago. So I think whoever painted it with the stripes on the nose kind of like painted a nice homage to the former history. Not really a heritage unit per se, but it's nice to see, and it's better than just a Norfolk Southern leased engine and a CSX lease engine, which are dime a dozen these days.
Yeah, so a nice nod to the past. Which, speaking of the past, I mean, you kind of hinted towards it. You've been doing some rail fanning for quite a long time.
Yeah, I guess ever since I was 3 years old is kind of my earliest memory. As I said earlier, I grew up basically at milepost 7.5 on what was the Lehigh and Hudson River Railway, and that was a bridge line that operated from Maybrook, New York, down to the Allentown, Pennsylvania area. Unfortunately, once the New Haven's Poughkeepsie Bridge burnt, they basically, along with all the other problems that Penn Central created and all the mergers in the Northeast railroading scene, 1960s and 70s, basically forced them into bankruptcy. And the overhead bridge traffic was lost. And at that point, they were basically just really running what was called Shuttle 1, which was a train that came out of Warwick, New York, and went up to Maybrook. And not much, online industry at that point. They did still have the zinc mine was still operating down in Franklin, New Jersey, which kind of kept them, some revenue still coming in. But at that time, a lot of the RS3s from the first generation of diesels were gone, and they still had a couple of the Alco C420s on hand. But I remember it still sticks in my mind to this day. Just looking out the back window, and the track was maybe, I want to say, about 1,000 feet away in the farmers' fields. And I just remember seeing these Canadian Pacific with the Pac-Man logo, 2 or 3 cars going by, which I later found pictures of. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Pictures of those trains up in Maybrook, so that kind of brought it full circle. But yeah, I guess as far as the rail fanning end went, I didn't know that much, until my late teenage years. My dad, kind of kept me, kind of got me started in the model railroading end. But as far as the prototypes, it wasn't anything that I knew a lot of interest, a lot of, great detail. I had the Erie Lackawanna's former main line over in Chester, New York, which in Gray Court, actually, Lehigh and Hudson went over, and they had an interchange over there. And, it wasn't until, I want to say, between 1987, 88, when I met Russell, that I really started to go and, track down all these former places, and by asking questions, finding out what was this line, where did this line go. That's how I started to get the interest and started to build up, my knowledge of actually what was going on in the Northeast, that I missed the bulk of it. And then once the New York, Susquehanna, and Western came along, and they decided they were going to run the transcontinental stack trains, they picked up the Lehigh and Hudson south of Warwick, which at that point was pretty much abandoned track traffic almost south of Sparta Junction. And they rebuilt their Sparta Mountain line, and they had trackage rights over Conrail's southern tier from Binghamton down to Campbell Hall through Port Jervis. And I remember I worked in the farmer next door, Rose Orchards. I worked there through high school and actually into college. And I remember Mark telling me, Mark was the owner, he came out one summer, he says, yeah, they're going to raise the bridge up here because they're going to run these giant double stacked trains. And I thought, we only saw the Conrail loco going by, we used to throw fruit and vegetables off of it, and hit the boxcars. And one time they actually stopped, and we thought we were going to be in trouble, but nothing ever came of it. I think they just, knew it was kids. But getting back to the story, though, he said, yeah, they're going to raise the bridge up. And they had a bridge that went from one side of the property to the other. And sure enough, that better part of the later part of the summer and the early fall, they raised the bridge up by 2 feet. And it's an old iron bridge. It goes, it's over 100 years old. And I remember the first time, it was in October, that they sent the first stack train east that I saw. And just as a kid, at age 16 or 17, to see these big 6-axle SD45s and Burlington Northern paint schemes, that's what they wound up picking up, come roaring through with a train I'd never seen in my life. Still sticks with me to this day, that wow, from the little branch line that I knew it as to this is going to be 4 or 5 trains a day now, which is what it turned out to be, and then some, was a huge jump. And that's what really got me going as far as photography. It's one of those days you'll never forget in your life, and that's kind of like the takeoff point where I really started to do the photography. And my dad got me my first 35 millimeter single lens reflex. It was a Nikon, and he taught me proper photography techniques, which I still value to this day. And then going forward, jumping into the digital age, and going from a VHS, which you had on your shoulder, and the 8 millimeter, high 8, all those smaller tapes, and then the mini DVs. And now I pretty much do everything on my iPhone and edit it, put it up on my YouTube channel. And, it's so the technology's changed. I haven't changed that much. I've gotten older, but as we all have.
Yeah, we sure have. Yeah, it's so that must have been a pretty amazing to, like you said, to see a small line like that grow into something serious like that with a whole bunch of great traffic. And earlier you were mentioning a mentor, and you mentioned his name again, and tell us a little bit about him.
Sure. So that was one of those days. It's a funny story, which I still tell a couple people these days. My parents had gone away to Florida. My sister was in college. I was home alone. I was, let's see, so it was 1988. So I was 16, basically. And, I had the scanner on. I heard them got their Form D from Warwick, which they would call in from Pelton Road to get their Form D to occupy the Hudson Secondary up to Maybrook. I said, okay, I got to go out. I'm going to get a picture of the train. So I didn't drive yet, didn't have my license. I walk up to the farmers' fields, get set up, and here are the SD45s coming across the sag between Gray Court and Craigville. That's where I grew up, in Craigville. And train pops out of what we call the tin tunnel. It's basically a big culvert that they rebuilt one of the bridges on one of the state highways back in late 70s. Right about the same time they almost actually abandoned the Lehigh Hudson through where I grew up. Train goes by, and I turn around. There's this gentleman standing there with a big grin on his face, gray sweatshirt, and he says to me, "Hey, you like trains, kid?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, I don't know if you want to, but I'm going to continue to follow him, and I'm going to probably go up to Maybrook and maybe go a little bit further west. If you want to join me, you're more than welcome to." So, casting all kinds of what we were taught in school, elementary school, don't go in a car with strangers, don't talk to strangers. I said, "Sure, I'll go." That was the day I started my friend with Russell Begg, and friendship, I should say. We went up to Maybrook. We saw them do what they called the run by move or run around move up there, because at that point, before they had built an actual direct connection from the Hudson Secondary onto the Graham line at that point, they had to go up to Maybrook, and they had to do a series of pull by or saw by move, because the track it was a runaround track, and they had to cut the power off and do a couple switching maneuvers to get the train headed back west again. So we went up there and spent, I don't know, maybe hour and a half, 2 hours, watched them do that, and then continued further west to a couple different spots along the way. And then we got up to Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania. And if you ever been up there, there's a nice bridge over the Lackawaxen River. But to get to that site, and this is pre-drone days, you have to go up a mountain, literally. And he said, I'll catch up with you, because he was, out of breath. He said, you just keep going to the top. You get to a rock outcrop, and you see, what, you know, you see the train down in front of you, the track down in front of you, and just get up there, kid, and I'll be right behind you. So we got up there, and I got a nice shot of them coming around the curve. And of course, when I get all these pictures back, because now I'm only shooting prints, I'm not even up to slides at this point. My parents said, Erik, how did you get these pictures? You don't drive. So I do my best Ricky Ricardo imitation. Lucy had some splaining to do, and I told them, and they were okay with it, but I later found out recently that my mother told me. She says, we that day, she said, we almost, pretty upset at you that day. I found this out almost 35 years ago, and it's one of those gambles I took in life, and I never looked back. And unfortunately, we lost Russell to a heart attack in 1996. But in the short time I did, spend quite a bit of time with him during, after high school, during my college days, and then some. He took me to a lot of great places in the Northeast. I'll never forget. We went out to Horseshoe Curve. My family went out, and him and his wife went out there. It wasn't the greatest weather, but just to go out to Horseshoe Curve in the Conrail days and see, them crossing the Alleghenies like that was one of the more memorable experiences. And we went down to Sand Patch on a couple times.
Wow.
And Cass Scenic down in West Virginia, the Valley Railroad up in Essex, Connecticut. There was too many to name almost. And he was a big steam excursion fan. So anytime that Norfolk Southern was running the 1218 or the 611, I never got to see the 611 then, but I did get to see the 1218 running from, I guess it's from Manassas to Front Royal. And that was an experience, because it was a 2-day trip that they did on both days. And that was my one and only time of seeing the 1218 run. But as I later found out, he did a lot of photography work before I met him. And that comes to, my next part of the discussion is that once he passed away, I still was in contact with his widow, Doris, and she contacted me one Labor Day weekend. It was right before my birthday. And she said, I have all of Russell's slides, movies, photography equipment, and I'm not sure, if you'd be interested in them. And I sat at his house maybe once or twice very early on, and remember he showed me some of his slides that he took of the Erie Lackawanna days. And I was, that was like, kid in the candy shop. Like, my eyes were glued. I didn't want to stop. I had to go home eventually, but
yeah,
I'd never seen any of his other work, and I didn't know the extent to which he actually took as many pictures and movies as he did in his lifetime. And, once I dove into it and I made several trips over and brought more and more stuff home, I think when I actually calculated the linear footage of the Super 8mm movie stock alone, something like 15 miles of actual footage.
Wow.
And that's, along with scanning all the 35mm slides and sifting through all the paperwork and the trip details. And because they saved just about everything on newspaper clippings or any kind of flyers that they used to send out in those days. So it's kind of like an archaeological dig back in time that I was given all this stuff. And half of the slides are actually labeled, cataloged, put in metal boxes. The other half that were still in the 35mm Kodak boxes that basically sat on this kitchen table for all these years, that's the part I have to really go through and sort and, pin down details as far as locations and everything else. But just having that was one of the, I would say it's probably the best gift other than my children I've received in my lifetime, because just to have that alone and to be able to scan it and see it firsthand is, it's a rare opportunity. And that's kept me busy and kind of kept me away from the model railroading end of the spectrum too, as well, because you have to balance a little bit of both and pick up where you left off, a couple months later, if you're doing the model railroading end, or you're doing the slide end, or you're doing the other things that keep me busy in life.
What an amazing opportunity. And I've been sitting here thinking about this. I'm like, weren't the 80s great? Like, Not to say there was stranger danger in the 80s. There's been stranger danger for many years. We were all taught in the 80s about stranger danger, but
Sure.
but the opportunity you had, although it may have made your mom a little nervous and your dad a little nervous, but somebody that was willing to take you under their wing and show you these places. And I think that's just an amazing thing that you were able to do that. And then at the very end, be able to get his collection.
Right.
Because just like we talked about just moments ago about these golden eras, I'm sure that Russell captured a golden era of a lot of things that now you're going to be fired up. And then when you're able to get that in a form where you're going to be able to share that with others, you've caught somebody else's golden era too. I mean, you have it in your hands that Russell captured that you're going to be able to share. What an awesome opportunity.
Right. I mean, it's just to be able to see. I've always been a Lehigh and Hudson fan, but I've converted over since the Lehigh, New England. But I've also shared a lot of interest in a lot of the anthracite railroads in the Northeast. And for that matter, the Western railroads always piqued my interest too. So to see what he covered, not just in the Northeast, but when he went out west, I mean, he spent. The funny story is that he married his wife Doris after she lost her first husband in 1973. And going through his photography, I never do this, but he actually spent the entire month of August. He actually got married on the New Hope and Ivyland Railroad down in Pennsylvania. Got married on the railroad in the cab of the locomotive.
Wow.
Had his wedding reception on the railroad, on the train. And I never knew any of this until I started looking at the pictures. And then went from New York State all the way out to Washington and everywhere in between for an entire month. And I actually did a complete PowerPoint program once for one of the historical societies on just his honeymoon trip, which was not a honeymoon in
in the traditional
in any
sense.
respect.
Yeah.
It was a railfan honeymoon.
Yeah.
But the beauty of it was that his wife Doris, if he was shooting movies, she would shoot the slide film.
Oh wow.
So you have both ends of the spectrum, and it's just remarkable to see what he shot from just not only the Erie Lackawanna, Lehigh and Hudson, just all the way up until 1996 into the Conrail era, and that's the stuff like you kind of took for granted. You grew up in the Conrail era; they're going to be around forever, right? And you could say that about modern day rail fanning too. It'll be here forever. It won't, and that's what you have to realize.
Yeah,
it's not going to be around forever.
That's why we can continue to encourage folks to just keep shooting, keep capturing what you see, because eventually it will change and there'll be something completely different. And who knows what we'll be talking about 20 years from now and saying, well, I remember when they used to. And yeah, and this is a great example of that. And your mentor, Russell, capturing all that and the stuff that you're capturing yourself and you've captured through the years, either on film or now in digital form, is going to be a treasure for somebody else down the road. So awesome stuff. And this must have really kicked off an interest not only in railroading of that time, but history overall and your understanding of how all this worked, because you've got a good deep knowledge of how this all used to operate in that area.
Yeah, I kind of tend to think that my dad's interest in not so much the railroad end of it, but he was involved in the Chester Historical Society, which was the next town over. And, he brought me to a lot of his meetings there, and I did get to see a couple of railroad presentations and just to grow up in a family that appreciated history and, taught you how to respect it. And my dad did a couple tours around the hamlet of Craigville where we grew up, and there were 3 different mills, from the Revolutionary era right up into the mid 1800s. And just hearing him talk and explain things, it's one of those things where you tend to value the history that came before you and respect it. And I guess that's kind of like the same parallel that I did with the railroads. And in fact, they took over the Chester former Erie Railroad station, and they couldn't get into the station because the door was locked. So they sent my dad, who was probably in his early 40s at the point. He was the youngest one out of the entire, elderly community that was there, to go in. And they said, Bob, you go in through the window and unlock the door from the inside. So they sent him in through the basement window. And that's how they got into the station after it had been abandoned. And, when they opened up for the first time and they realized, how much work had to be performed on it. But yeah, the history end of it's always been an interesting facet for me. And my 3 children, I think one of them is going to share that same dream because he has a huge interest in ships and especially the Titanic. So it's nice to see, like, he'll go online and come up with all these facts and figures, which I say, for a 9-year-old, we grew up in the days before YouTube and all this internet technology. And, it's fascinating to see some of the things that he's researched and come up with and retained, and actually, caught me off guard a couple of times.
What's amazing is your ability to be able to share this with your son, and whether it be him going trackside with you, or just the passion for history that's got to be an amazing thing to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It really, it's a gift of fatherhood. I could say that, if you can pass one thing on to your kids, it's one of the things that you like to do the most, and they enjoy doing it with you. That's, it's really heartfelt when, they say, especially my oldest son, Dad, can we go rail fanning? It's sure. Because I know the days are going to be numbered. He's in college now, and the days just become less and less frequent that's going to happen. So it's, you have to seize those days and make them count.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don't let any of them go by without being able to take as much advantage of it as possible. You mentioned he's into ships. When you go to Mine Dock, is he watching the water traffic just as much as he's watching the rail traffic? Because that's a great spot. That's kind of what's nice about Mine Dock. You can do trains, and if there's no trains, there's always river traffic with all the ships going up and down the river too.
Yeah, he's asked a couple of times. Unfortunately, he hasn't been with us he's my youngest, and he hasn't been with us for a couple of our outings. But, every once in a while he'll say, Dad, can we go to that river place? And, they like to throw rocks in the river and just, be kids basically. And that's nice to see him to get out and actually, get off the virtual reality or off their keyboards and, actually do things that, kids should be doing, and getting outside and exercising, that type of stuff.
That's for sure. So let's go back to when you were a kid, and how does this model railroading stuff start to tie into all this prototype stuff you're doing?
Well, it's kind of like, we talked about earlier. It's kind of the same thing. Christmas time, my dad goes out and gets an N scale Atlas train set and brings it upstairs, and my sister spills the beans, says to my mom, like, Daddy went out and bought a train set for Eric. And it was one of those, annual things where the Christmas tree setup was not just a one day thing with my dad. he he would set it up on one day, usually in the evening, and then the next day put the lights on it, and then decorate it another night. And by the third or fourth day, we have what we call the village. And he'd put the trains up and loop a track around there, but he had all his S scale buildings, paper buildings, cardboard buildings, and little figures and things like that. And that's where it got started. And I would spend countless hours at Christmas time, for the 2 weeks that the tree was up, buried behind there, and just watching this 10 or 11 car train running around chasing itself. And I think it was a 280 Indiana Harbor Belt engine, but I think he took the pilot wheels off the front. So I remember it as an 080. And, that's where it started. And then a couple Christmases later, as I got older, woke up one morning and they brought me downstairs, and there's the typical, I think it was a Bachmann set with a steam engine. It was a Reading 280 again. And they had bought, just besides the train set, they had bought, a couple other cars like AHM cars and Tyco cars and stuff like that. You remember that from the 70s. And, it grew from there. My dad went on to build a 4 by 16 foot layout in the cellar, and he put some Homosote down and painted it green. And then he got these, I don't remember where he got them from, but he got these books that you would cut out the paper houses and structures and stuff like that. And, it was something that he would build for me. I couldn't, I didn't have the ability to use an X-Acto knife at that age, or, understand how to glue them. And, he had more patience than I would have at that point, let's say. And, he put some buildings up around the layout. And over time, he kind of got away from it, got more busy with his, career in teaching. And I would just go down there, and, he bought me the couple of the Atlas track work diagram books, blueprint books, things like that. And then I would just tear it down and start over from scratch, and, never really get it completed, kind of like experiment, and, just keep building different layouts in that 4 by 16 foot area. And then at one point I made the jump to N scale. I don't know what prompted that. I guess maybe just because my friend across the street had an N scale set that we would operate together. Then I decided to do N scale for a while. But then the trains got put away more or less after I moved out. And it wasn't until I moved out and got into my own house that I brought the trains back out when my oldest son was born, and I did a narrow shelf layout around the utility room. That was before we moved into our current house. Kind of a funny story. I had all the trains downstairs in the dining room in boxes, and I came home one night, and my wife said, Dante got into your trains today, and you might get upset. I said, oh, why? What happened? Well, all those boxes you had downstairs? They're all out of the boxes, and they're all around the dining room right now. So, of course, I couldn't get upset. I thought it was really cute. I knew at that point that the apple did not fall too far from the tree because, he got bit by the bug. So then once we moved into the house we're in currently, I started in the garage. I just took over the garage. Everybody goes to the cellar when they buy a new house. I went to the garage. We didn't have a cellar. And, I started building at that point, and that was 2010 when we moved here. And that layout got moved around the basement a couple times as well. And then, it currently, I guess there were a couple model railroads in between that I never really got too serious, never got completed. But in 2021, I guess I would say, I really decided that, knowing from operating at other layouts and seeing things being operated prototypically and being to op sessions, I really kind of buckled down and said, this is where I want to go in the direction with the layout, the next layout I built. And it was always kind of a rush to like slap down the flex track and, not really have a plan in mind or anything and not do anything prototypically, more or less. But I think it was when I watched Todd Herman, who's down in Virginia. He has a layout on the Catasauqua branch of the Lehigh, New England. And when I watched his video on YouTube, I said, this is a railroad that I've always known about, the Lehigh, New England. It operated into Maybrook with the Lehigh and Hudson, the O&W, Erie, Lackawanna, New Haven. And I said, there's something about this railroad that just piques my interest. And I made the decision to model the Martins Creek branch, which was basically in the heart of Pennsylvania's cement territory, and never looked back since. It's been one of those things where I've just kind of like taken my time, learned how to scratch build my own turnouts, do my own handling a track, and I set my pace. And it's one of those things that eventually will get completed, but I'm not in any rush to do it right now with everything else going on in life. But it's one of those things where you have to be a serious model railroader. There's a couple things that you really have to pay attention to make it as enjoyable, not only for yourself, but for people that are going to come over and operate it. So, I think I've pretty much gotten down the bench work for the first stages, I call it, of the yard, and I'm going to continue like in phases, basically, to continue constructing and the layout as as time permits. And of course, things come along in life, as we know, that throw curveballs at you too. But
Sure.
it's one of those things where it's kind of I'll go down there a couple times a week when I can, and just if I'm not working on the railroad itself, I'm putting decoders into my own locomotives or building up an inventory of railroad specific rolling stock. And kind of it's kind of rolling along, not as quick as I'd like to, but I know it's one of those challenges where you have to be patient, and you have to make time for it, but you also have to make time for your family and everything else in life.
Well, what I found too, and one of the things I seemingly keep saying over again, is the beauty of the model railroading hobby is that it will wait for you.
Mhm.
Life does get challenging. There's certainly many challenges that folks go through. I know you're going through some challenges as well, and I've gone through some challenges, and it will wait for you. That's the coolest part. It will be there when you're ready for it, and you kind of think the passion to get back to it also helps drive you through some of those challenges as well. I want to go back a little bit and talk about some of your false starts, because you mentioned a little bit about it, but do you have any regrets about those false starts, or would you say that they really kind of helped you to land where you are now?
No, absolutely not. I wrote some pre-show notes, and kind of like the 10 commandments of Eric's model railroading journey. I think one of the things you have to realize is that you can't be afraid. First of all, you have to put your best foot forward, and you have to be confident that you can you can learn. Like there's so many times I hear people, well, I can't do decoder installation. I can't go from DC to DCC. It's one of those things where there's so much information out there that's so readily available these days, that if you have the time just to sit down, half an hour each night and just do your research and just be patient. It will come to you. One of the things that I always struggled with was good soldering. And until I actually watched somebody do it and did it well and taught you, the proper steps in doing it, once I learned it, I never looked back. And that it kind of like, meshes together with everything else you do as far as DCC would, like I said, putting in your own decoders and, not being afraid to wire your decoders with a soldering iron, or do track work, do feeders, do things like that. You have to learn these things to succeed if you're really gonna, you really want a railroad that runs properly. And, just take the time to learn it and don't make excuses. There's the only excuse you can make is you don't have enough time to. Like, everybody doesn't have enough time to, but it's one of those things where if you're patient and you really want to learn it and do it the proper way, you have to drill down on these things and do your research and pay attention.
And research is there's a plethora of information available right at our fingertips nowadays. It really
Oh yeah.
is, accessible. You're absolutely right. And yeah, you gotta do it. You gotta try it and mess a few things up along the way. And that's where the learning begins.
Yeah, but as far as regrets, no, I don't regret it. They were all fun to build. They were all different. They, like I said, I went from area Lackawanna to modeling because my son and I had gotten the River Rossi, the later generation River Rossi, the U-28s that came out in Burlington Northern Pacific, and having Russell's pictures too also helped me spark an interest in the Western roads. So I did that for a little while, and then I jumped back. I thought I was going to model like a Midwestern grain railroad and things like that, and then just one of those days, it just clicked on me. I said, it's okay to have a continuous running track, layout. That's what I was always, brought up with, and I didn't know about the point to point end of it so much, and didn't know about the operations end of it either. But if you think about it, we're going to go backwards here as far as my 10 commandments. Life is a point to point journey. There's a lot of repetitive loops on it or, sidetracks. But when it comes down to it, how you operate your life is basically how you operate your model railroad, right? You go from one point in life to another point. It's the same thing on a model railroad. And the things you learn along the way are what make you a better person for who you are. But, going back to, I'm a big fan of doing my own track work. And the way that got started was I had gotten a couple turnouts and they just brand new right out of the box. The frogs were not right. They were causing all kinds of problems. And right around the same time COVID hit, everybody's online. There's a lot of free time. I worked through COVID. I didn't have that luxury except for like maybe 6 weeks. We were on a abbreviated schedule, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. But I, worked right through COVID. We were declared essential workers, and I didn't have that that ability. But you learned a lot from other people that did, go out and start making their own videos and things like this. So there was a guy who models the Frisco Railroad, the White River lines, and I watched Drew's channel, routinely. Just he was releasing videos, left and right about how he started doing his own hand laying track, and I got a lot of good knowledge and a lot of good inspiration out of that. So that's one of those things like. There's so much information out there, but this comes back to my rules too. Like, there's so much information, it's easy to get swallowed up into it and easy to lose track of, like, you go online to research something and then, you go down the rabbit hole and then before you know it, 3 hours have gone by and, your railroad's still waiting for you to get back to, so you gotta stay focused and you gotta, stay on point with what you go out there to research for.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point there. I mean, it's kind of analysis paralysis, right? Where you start to
Yep.
get too much information, and then
Yep.
you become overwhelmed and you're paralyzed by it. And trying to
Yeah.
avoid that, just find some good sources you can trust and stick to those because, yeah, you can pretty much find, each viewpoint on the internet on any topic, the yay and the nay. So you
Yeah.
just got to try to find somebody that you can really believe in and try to follow that path for a while.
Mhm. I know there's a few people, that get stuck with the analysis paralysis, and they want to do things as prototypically as possible. I understand it, but when it comes right down to it, you have to make sacrifices. You can't model it every inch for inch, right?
Right.
It's not going to happen. You just don't have the time or the budget or anything like that. And really, the person that's going to know your railroad the best is going to be yourself. You're going to do the research. So if somebody comes over and they want to nitpick because this wasn't like this, that's fine. But in the end, like, you have to do things that will work out for you ultimately, and you can't get stuck on those points. They're going to hold you back and completely just. I've seen it happen where people just they don't build anything because they get stuck. You have to build your railroad for not only yourself, but you have to think in terms of, are you going to do an operating session? You can have more than just you in your layout room or wherever you have to lay out. You have to make sure you have plenty of aisle space. You have to make sure that the track plan you create doesn't create bottlenecks, or it has to be fun to operate. If it's not fun to operate, you're not going to get people that want to come to your operating sessions. And so it's one of those things where, like, a lot of people know these things too. There's nothing new about it, but you have to think about that before you make the leap, let's say, and before you start your track plan. You have to have a track plan, guaranteed, even if it's just something in your head. But I used to just put things together randomly and not really know. There was no rhyme or reason to it, and that's one of the things. Like you said, like, do I regret it? No, because you learn from those things. Like, you have to put it out on paper at least, and know what you're capable of. That's another one. Like, know what you physically can manage as far as, like, budgeting, and are you going to build this great big railroad that's going to take you 10 years to complete? And when you turn around and you look at it, you say, I'm not happy with it because I made all these mistakes. Or do you focus on, like in my case, the Martins Creek branch was only 17 miles long, and I can't model all 17 miles of it. I'm going to have to, there's going to be selective towns along the way that, like Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and Stockertown were two of the big cement mills on the railroad. And Stockertown, they also did Lehigh Valley interchange, and Nazareth, you had the Lackawanna's Bangor and Portland branch too. Come in there. So, like, you have to narrow down your focus to say, okay, these are going to be the prime industries and the prime locations, and everything in between, with selective compression. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, oh well, just, do what works.
A good layout tells a story. Compression helps take the boring parts out.
Exactly.
And that helps you tell a great story. Great stories don't have boring parts. They don't have the mundane details that nobody needs to know. They don't need to know what socks you put on that day when you ran, ran a marathon. They don't. That's not important. That's not the important part, right?
Exactly.
So that's and I don't even know why I came up with the analogy of running, because this guy has never run a mile in his life. But nonetheless, take those boring parts out, and then that tells your better story of your layout. You mentioned before you had a mentor when it came to the prototype in photography with Russell. Who's been influencing you when it comes to model railroading?
It's a really excellent question, right? It's kind of collective, but, like, I find myself, with time on my hands, and I wanted to learn the DCC aspect of it, which, is, if you're gonna have a layout with DCC, you have to know the ins and outs of it. And, other than Pester and Don Iris, every once in a while with some DCC questions, decoders and stuff like that. He's great. Never met him personally, but we communicated, via Facebook and everything else. I want to say Larry Puckett, the DCC guy, because he's got a really good channel, and he covers not only the DCC aspect of it, but he covers multiple aspects of model railroading. Watching his channel, it's done well. It's up until recently, he was putting out basically every other week almost, or every week he was putting out a new show. And that's kind of where I drew a lot of the inputs, as far as starting the process going on the Martins Creek branch. So yeah, I would say Larry from the DCC guy.
So tell us more about the Martins Creek branch and what you've got in your mind planned for this layout that you're putting together.
So it started once I tore down the old layout. I really needed to take, I didn't want to take all the cars off and just put them back in boxes and store them until I built the new layout. So, they kind of, like, hung out in the garage in different areas on a workbench. And, at that point I still was, had all the old, 50-foot box cars and stuff that wasn't going to work. So that stuff got packed up and, eventually hopefully get sold. But I started coming up with the bench work and planning. And I said, I don't want to do anything deeper than 2 feet wide. And it's basically kind of like if you took Don's layout and cut it in half with the helix in the center and, the peninsula. So it's like a big J shape. So it's going to be a multi-deck, 2-level layout. And I built the yard as kind of like almost like a holding area to get all the cars put there. And then ultimately it decided that was going to be what's called Tadmore Yard, which was kind of a little bit east of Bath, Pennsylvania. I started there and I scratch built, it had, I have eight tracks for the entire yard. And the real Tadmore Yard had quite a few more and had what was called the thoroughfare, which was like 2 tracks to get around the yard. It's actually one of the few places where it actually had double track on the whole line. So I started there, and it's been a work in progress. Let's say I got all the turnouts built. I built the turnouts not individually, but I built them as like 3 or 4 turnout sections, so I could use one continuous common rail when I could, and built them as skeletons. Started building with the fast tracks jigs, and then started going completely just by using the paper templates and gluing the templates onto Homoso, and cutting my own PC ties and cutting my own basswood ties as well, because it's, let's face it, you need all different sizes for the turnouts, and it just made more sense economically just do it on your own. So I was ripping pieces of basswood down with a micro engineering table saw and stuff like that. So I just started really banging it out. Let's say day in and day out for a while there. Got everything down as far as the yard, and that's what I considered phase 1. Phase 2 will be from the yard going railroad east towards Nazareth, and at that point you'll have the like I said, the Lackawanna's B&P branch alongside of it, and there's several huge cement complexes that have to get built for that, and that'll be on the peninsula opposite where the yard is currently, and then a helix, and then that brings you up to the second level, which will have the rest of the big players on the railroad, Stockertown, and eventually wind up at the town of Martins Creek, which you've been there. You've took your drone up and photographed the existing Alpha Cement Works for me on a whim, which I
Yeah.
appreciate. And so there's really going to be like 4 main areas with the concrete industry is the backbone of what was the core business of the Lehigh and New England, right until they were abandoned in 1961, and that came about because Pennsylvania, up until that point, only allowed the bulk of the cement business to ship via railroad. And then ruling was changed, and they went to trucks. And the parent company in Lehigh, New England, Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, saw the handwriting on the wall. And even though the anthracite business on the line from Tamaqua through Penn Argyl up to Maybrook, that was the bridge line traffic for the anthracite end of it, the cement belt region was profitable. And for them to just abandon the entire line, they kept a small piece out, just still operated out by Tamaqua these days, by the Reading and Northern, and they kept the Martins Creek branch and the Bethlehem branch. So those are the 3 pieces that were left after the Lehigh New England was officially abandoned in 1961. Eventually, C&J took over operations into the early 70s, and then Lehigh Valley, ultimately Conrail, and now currently today Norfolk Southern still operates up out of Bethlehem. They operate a local 5 or 6 days a week, I believe. I've caught them down there. And, there's still a few of the cement mills, but at one time, I think it was 15, 16 big cement mills. And I believe if you do your research, Panama Canal was, one of the places where a lot of the concrete traffic was shipped to. New York City itself, of course, Empire State Building, I believe, and Rockefeller Center, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
Came out of the cement belt region, and I believe Hoover Dam as well. So they shipped stuff out west. It's a unique railroad to model because its core business was basically on the Martins Creek branch. Let's say cement traffic in or cement traffic out, I would say, and bituminous coal for the concrete concrete mills. And of course, Lehigh, New England itself was anthracite road. You had the anthracite traffic on the main line, but until I started doing my research, I started getting all these Lehigh, New England cars, and then realizing, wait a minute, like then you start seeing the B&O and the C&O cars and all these other roads. Like, what's the story behind there? And I found out that they were bringing in quite a bit of bituminous coal from points south. In fact, railroad you're familiar with, the Reading had a branch from Albertus up to Catasauqua, and that was the main conduit for the bituminous coal coming from points south to get onto the Lehigh, New England, to the concrete mills. And you have core business of cement in boxcars and bag cement in boxcars, and then in bulk cement and covered hoppers. So that's predominantly what I've gone back and reevaluated what rolling stock I have. And Bowser's come out with all these great American Car and Foundry 70-ton hoppers. Bowser's come out with the 40-foot boxcars painted in the black and white Lehigh, New England billboard scheme. Of course, Atlas released the cement hoppers, 70-ton hoppers for not only Lehigh, New England, but Lehigh Valley, Reading, things like that, Pennsylvania. What I also realized, what I learned along the way, was that even though New York Central was a big, concrete area up in the Hudson Valley, that when the New York State Thruway was being built in the late 1950s, there was so much demand put on the New York Central for that commodity that the Lehigh, New England kind of took advantage of that and started exporting more of their concrete up into New England, because it's just, the volume that they needed to construct the Thruway was unheard of. And, they took advantage of, of another market that the New York Central pretty much had a stronghold on up until that point. So it was a fascinating thing. It's still ongoing. I'm still buying books, and people are giving me books. My friend Doug Barbario's been getting me all these Peter Brill books on the Lehigh, New England, and getting me car diagram books off the Lackawanna, because it's not just Lehigh, New England that's fascinating. It's the railroads that went along with it in the area. Like they had the bottle cars. I don't know if you're familiar with the bottle cars, but they were these 5 or 6 containers in a gondola that they were hot traffic, basically. So if the railroad made sure that they kept those cars moving to the New York City area, and modeling those cars is another thing, one of those side projects I'll eventually get to do. And some people, have done really spectacular jobs modeling those, but it's not just box cars and covered hoppers. There's other, key rolling stock that have to get modeled too as well.
Well, boy, it sounds like you've really landed on the right railroad after a few of those false starts that you would not change anything about. Taking all of this passion that you've picked up through a mentor early on, and taking all that prototype information and combining it with a passion for model railroading into one where you can really put your love of history and start to really sink your teeth into it and then apply it to your railroad is just really phenomenal. It's a really cool story, Erik, and so glad you came on Around the Layout and shared that story with us. And we're going to share a whole bunch of photos and links and everything else related to this episode on our website, aroundthelayout.com/138. We didn't even get to scratch the surface on a bunch of stuff. Your involvement with historical societies, and we could talk prototype rail fanning for more hours and hours, but we do have to wrap it up. I do appreciate you coming on and sharing. We're going to get you back on. We'll be talking a whole lot more.
Thanks, Ray. I enjoyed every minute of it, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.